What does it mean to be you? What does it mean to have a specific, conscious experience of the world around you, and yourself within it? Historically, humanity has considered the nature of consciousness to be a primarily spiritual or philosophical inquiry. But scientific research is now mapping out compelling biological theories and explanations for consciousness and selfhood. In his latest book, Anil Seth investigates the biological basis of conscious experience. Anil Seth is a leading expert on the neuroscience of consciousness and one of most prominent spokespeople for this relatively new field of science. His radical argument is that we do not perceive the world as it objectively is, but rather that we are prediction machines, constantly inventing our world, and correcting our mistakes by the microsecond. And that we can now observe the biological mechanisms in the brain that accomplish this process of consciousness. He talks about the research during a virtual presentation at the Indian Science Festival.
I think we need to start, as always, with a definition. When we talk about consciousness, what exactly are we talking about? Well, I think the definition is very simple. And we're not going to come up with a consensus definition that everybody automatically agrees with. But what I want to do is give an intuitive definition, just so we don't talk past each other, that we can start off at least on the same page. And for me, consciousness is any kind of subjective experience whatsoever. It's not the same as intelligence. It's not the same as language. It's not the same as the experience of being a self. It's any experience, whether it's pain, pleasure, a thought, an emotion, a feeling of intention. These are all aspects of consciousness. Now, a little bit more formally, I always prefer to start with the definition of the philosopher Thomas Nagel. We were just hearing about the philosophy of science in India. Thomas Nagel, the great philosopher and historian of science too. And his definition of consciousness, which goes back to the 1970s, is that an organism has conscious mental states if and only if there is something it is like to be that organism. If it feels like something to be that organism, it feels like something to be me, it feels like something to be each one of you. It probably feels like something to be a bat. As Thomas Nagel's famous paper said, for those of you who know it, what is it like to be a bat? We humans don't know, we can't experience the inner universe of a bat, but for the bat, it feels like something to be that bat. And the same for probably many other animals too. But there is probably nothing it feels like to be a stapler or a table or even an iPhone. It's a mechanism, a complex mechanism, but it doesn't feel like anything to be that complex mechanism. That's the broadest definition of consciousness. Now, this raises the question of how do we begin to understand consciousness within our wider picture of the natural world. And our wider picture of the natural world, at least in Western science and philosophy, tends to be materialistic, tends to be physicalist, tends to be in terms of some description of matter and the interactions among whatever matter ultimately is. And so how do these interactions give rise to or in some way become identical with consciousness is one of these outstanding problems in science and philosophy that's been with us in different guises and in different cultures for thousands of years. And it's probably most best crystallized, or certainly the best known crystallization of this problem is by David Chalmers, the philosopher who took this problem, which has been articulated by René Descartes, by all sorts of people, and put it in terms of the hard problem of consciousness. Here is what he says. He says, this is in the 90s, "It is widely agreed that experience arises from a physical basis, but we have no good explanation of why and how it so arises. Why should physical processing give rise to a rich inner life at all? It seems objectively unreasonable that it should, and yet it does." So Chalmers contrast this hard problem with the easy problems of neuroscience, of consciousness. And the easy problems basically are all the problems that neuroscience or any science can tackle that need not make any reference to consciousness at all. How the brain as a mechanism implements all the functions and underlies all the behaviors that it does. How it transforms sensory input into muscle contractions and outputs and things like that. These, of course, are not easy problems. They're very, very challenging problems. But the intuition is there's no conceptual mystery that functions and behaviors can in principle be explained by complex mechanisms. That's the normal business of science and engineering. And Chalmers' intuition is that even after you've solved all these easy problems, at the end of neuroscience, this hard problem will remain pristine, untouched, as mysterious as it seems today. And this gives rise, this sort of motivates this idea of dualism, that the physical universe and the universe of consciousness are two different modes, and the challenge is then how they interact. That's one way to think about this. Of course, thinking of this mystery in this very black and white sense gives rise to a bunch of other potential responses. One that's becoming increasingly popular, at least if not academically, it's certainly getting a lot more air these days, is this idea of panpsychism, that consciousness is somehow fundamental and ubiquitous. It's somehow in everything and everywhere. Now, this obviates the hard problem, because if consciousness is built into the fabric of the universe from the ground up, well, you don't need to explain how it comes to be. So it's consistent. The issue, or at least my issue with panpsychism, is not so much that it seems crazy, it's just that it doesn't explain anything, it can't be tested, and it doesn't generate any testable hypotheses. So it's a bit of a lame answer to, I think, this mystery that we all face about trying to understand what consciousness is like and why it's there. Now, another extreme, and this is again a position articulated by a number of philosophers like Keith Frankish, Daniel Dennett, Mike Graziano, is that we're just mistaken if we think there's anything particularly special or significant about the consciousness as a scientific and philosophical problem. Illusionism is the position that consciousness doesn't really exist, at least not how we normally think of it. Now, I have a bit more sympathy for this position, but I think of it as a bit like a powerful medicine. If you take just the right amount, it's very helpful because it can undercut some of our naive intuitions about what we're trying to explain when we're trying to explain consciousness. An example of such a naive intuition would be that the conscious self is the recipient of conscious experiences rather than part of consciousness. And we'll come to that later. But if you take too much of this illusionist medicine, I think you get into trouble, because then you start denying the central phenomenon that we're trying to explain, that conscious experiences are real, that they exist, that there is something it is like to be a conscious creature. So that's illusionism. So I find it just useful to know, just to stake out the territory. But the approach I take is neither of these really, although illusionists sometimes claim that it is. It's called the real problem of consciousness, not the hard problem and not the easy problem. And the real problem of consciousness, this is the approach I just explore in the book, is to ask a slightly different question. It's to ask, how can mechanisms and processes in the brain and the body explain, predict, and control properties of consciousness, both functional, like what can we do in virtue of being conscious, and critically, phenomenological. Why is a visual experience the way it is and different from, let's say, an olfactory experience or an emotional experience? What about what happens in brains and bodies that explains the qualitative, phenomenal character of different kinds of experiences? That's the real problem. Now, this is neither the hard problem nor the easy problem. It's not the hard problem because we're not trying to say how and why consciousness is part of the universe in the first place. It's also not the easy problem because we're not sweeping the mystery of consciousness away under the carpet and pretending it doesn't exist. It's certainly not a new approach. It inherits from a number of traditions. The tradition that I think is closest is often called neurophenomenology, pioneered by people like Francesco Varela, Evan Thompson, and so on, which is again this idea of understanding phenomenological properties in terms of neural mechanisms. Now, if we do this, and I'm going to give you some examples of what this looks like in practice, then I do think we stand a chance of coming up with a satisfactory science of consciousness. But instead of solving the hard problem of David Chalmers head on, I think we'll achieve this through dissolving it. And there's a precedent to thinking this way. And the main precedent for me is how we came to a modern understanding of life. It was not that long ago, again in Western scientific circles, that life was considered to be beyond the remit of physics and chemistry, that there had to be some spark of life, some special source, some élan vital that explained the difference between the living and the non-living. This was the philosophy of vitalism, which was very prominent in the late 19th through a surprising chunk of the 20th century. But of course, as biologists got on with the job of explaining the properties of living systems like metabolism and reproduction, and so on, in terms of physics and chemistry, then this hard problem of life seemed little by little less mysterious, and eventually it dissolved. It wasn't solved. It wasn't like people found the spark of life or proved that life didn't exist. It's just that the need to appeal to that sense of there being one big scary mystery faded away as we understood more about how to explain properties in terms of mechanisms. And I think the same strategy is helping us and will help us understand consciousness. Now, I don't want to overdo this parallel. It's obviously consciousness and life are not the same thing. Methodologically, the big difference between trying to understand a living system and trying to understand consciousness is that you can put a living system on a table or on a lab bench and all look at it and all agree about what the data are. You can agree about what's going on. But a conscious experience is intrinsically private and subjective. I can describe my conscious experiences, but that's not the same as you having direct access to what I'm experiencing. You cannot put a conscious experience on the table and look at it in the same way you can put a frog on a table and look at it. But this doesn't mean that the science of consciousness is impossible. No, it just means the relevant data are harder to collect, and that's a challenge, but it shouldn't undermine this approach. Okay, so if we take this approach, next comes the question of, well, if we're not going to treat consciousness as one big scary mystery, how do we treat it? How do we divvy it up into different properties? And there are many ways to do this. My preferred way is in terms of three basic features of consciousness: conscious level, how conscious you are. This is broadly the difference between being in a dreamless sleep or under anesthesia and being awake and aware, as we all are now. Conscious content: when you are conscious, you're conscious of something. The people, places, and objects that populate are conscious seen at any one time. And then there's conscious self, the experience of being an individual in the world, of being you. Now, I'm not going to talk about level today, but I'm going to talk about content and a little bit about self in the 15 minutes I have left. So there's one animating idea that I think is very useful to understand why our experiences of the world and of the self are the way they are. And this is the idea that the brain is a prediction machine, and that what we see, hear, and feel are nothing other than the brain's best guesses about the causes of its sensory inputs. Now, this is, again, not a new idea. Its roots can be traced back in philosophy as far as you want to go, at least as far as Plato, for instance, and this allegory of the cave of Plato, where the shadows cast by firelight on the walls of this cave are treated as the real world by the prisoners within, because that's all they know. Updating that allegory to the 21st century, the 20th century, we come up with this idea of perception as inference. And understand this, just change perspective for a bit and imagine that you are your brain. And there you are, you're stuck inside a bony skull trying to figure out what's out there in the world. Now, there's no light in the skull, there's no sound. All you've got to go on as a brain are streams of electrical signals which are only indirectly related to what's out there in the world, whatever that might be. So perception, this process of figuring out what's there, has to be a process of informed guesswork in which ambiguous sensory signals are combined with the brain's prior expectations or beliefs about the way the world is to form the brain's best guess of the causes of these signals. The brain doesn't see light or hear sound. What we perceive is the brain's best guess of what's out there. Let me give you a couple of examples to show at least how this works a little bit in practice. And you may have seen this illusion before. I can't see any faces, but maybe you'll have seen this before. This is Adelson's checkerboard. And in this illusion, there are two patches, A and B, and hopefully they look to be different shades of grey, with B looking lighter. Now, it's an illusion. Of course, they're exactly the same shade of grey. And I can show you that if I just put another version up with the two patches joined together. And you can see it's one continuous shade of grey. Just to show I'm not messing around, I can move that bar across and you can see now it really is a single continuous shade of grey. But take it away and they look different again. So what's happening here? Well, what's happening here is that the brain is using its prior knowledge encoded into the circuitry of the visual cortex, knowledge that you may not be aware that your brain has, that objects under shadow appear darker than they are. And so we see the patch B as lighter than it really is. And this underlines the point that vision isn't supposed to be a camera. It's not supposed to sort of be a light meter. It's supposed to infer what's out there in the world on the basis of ambiguous data. So we see B as lighter than it really is. Now that's one example of the general problem of perception. And this is the only equation I'm going to show in this talk, and it's Bayes' theorem. And Bayes' theorem is it provides a framework for understanding what the brain is doing when it's doing this kind of predictive perception. And what it's doing is it's taking what it knows, believes now, the so-called prior. You can see that, that's the curve, the dotted or short dash line. And Bayes' theorem tells us mathematically how to update a prior belief on the basis of new data. And the new data here is the likelihood to come up with an updated belief, which is the posterior. It's basically going from what we already believe to what we should believe given some new information when everything is laden with a certain amount of uncertainty. That's what Bayesian inference is all about. And that's, at least at one very high level, that's what the brain has to do when it's trying to interpret the causes of the sensory signals that impinge on its eyes, ears, and so on. Now, fast forward again to the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries, we have Hermann von Helmholtz, who was probably the first person to suggest directly that what the brain is doing in perception is a kind of unconscious inference. We're not conscious of this process. We didn't know that our brain knew about how objects behave under shadow. We're only conscious of the outcome of that process. We see the patches being different shades of grey. So Helmholtz talked about perception as a process of unconscious inference. And now we think about this in terms of actual neural circuits and mechanisms. This is one such circuit mechanism story, which is called predictive processing. This is something I've been very interested in for a number of years, nearly 15 years now. And this is a way by which the brain can actually achieve or implement Bayesian inference or approximate it. And the idea is that what's happening in the brain is that connections that come from the inside out or the top down are continually conveying predictions about the causes of sensory signals. And then the sensory signals, the stuff that flows from the world into the brain, is just conveying the difference between what the brain expects and what it gets at every level of processing. It's conveying the prediction errors. And the idea is that by minimizing, by updating predictions to minimize prediction errors everywhere and all the time, the brain's predictions will settle on this Bayesian posterior, this best guess of what's out there. And the hypothesis is that that is what we consciously perceive, this continually evolving brain-based best guess that is calibrated by sensory data from the world. Now, this is a really different way to think about perception. It's so easy to think, for us to think of perception as this process of reading out the world from the outside in or the bottom up, as if the world just pours itself into our minds through the transparent windows of our ears and our eyes and our other senses. This is the sort of naive classical straw man view of perception as a bottom-up process of feature extraction from data as it streams into the perceptual cortices. This is the visual cortex of a monkey, and early areas might respond to things like edges and lines, and then later deeper areas to more complex features like faces and objects. In dramatic contrast to that view, predictive processing suggests that perceptual content is not conveyed by reading out these sensory signals in an inside-out, in an outside-in direction, but is conveyed by top-down predictions. The bottom-up sensory signals convey just the prediction errors, the difference between what we get, what we expect and what we get. So perception is always in the process of active generation, not a passive registration of what happens to be out there. Okay. Now, you might think I've diverted a little bit from the core question of consciousness, but what I'm trying to provide is a language in which we can think about why conscious experiences are the way they are. So predictive processing itself is not a theory of consciousness in the sense of like it's telling you the sufficient ingredients for a system to be conscious. It's a general theory of perception and action and cognition and so on that can be used to explain properties of what experiences are like in terms of their underlying mechanisms, exactly in the style of the real problems that I just mentioned. Now, let me give you a couple of examples. If something like this is on the right track, it would suggest that we should consciously perceive what the brain expects more accurately and more quickly than what is not expected. And we tested this idea in an experiment many years ago now with my postdoc at the time, Yaya Pinto. And we used a method called continuous flash suppression, where we expose different images to the different eyes. So one eye sees an image of a face or a house, which gradually increases in contrast. And the other eye sees a changing pattern of colored blobs, which gradually decreases in contrast. And what the person sees is firstly just the blobs, because they're high contrast. And at some point, the image breaks through into conscious perception, and the person just has to press house or face when they see the relevant image. And what we also did, and you can see this here too, is that we cued people to expect a face or a house. And sometimes the cue was valid, and sometimes it was not valid. And what we found was when the cue was valid, that's when the sensory data matched the prediction, the expectation, people indeed responded more accurately and more quickly. So people see what they expect rather than what they don't expect, at least in this one experiment. Now, we can use the same idea to think about unusual forms of perception, perhaps when perceptual predictions overwhelm sensory data. We're used to this in everyday life when we see things like faces and clouds. This is an example of the general phenomenon of pareidolia, seeing patterns in things. We can see faces in clouds, we can see faces in the windows of churches, and so on and so on. The idea being that the brain has very strong predictions to see faces. Faces are very salient, so we tend to perceive faces even when faces don't exist. So what we've been doing in my research group at Sussex is taking this idea a little bit further and trying to build computational models of different kinds of unusual visual experience, a method called computational phenomenology or computational neurophenomenology. Now, the first example of this, we used a standard deep learning neural network, which is very good at classifying what objects are in images. But we ran it backwards. This is using an adaptation of an algorithm called Google's Deep Dream. And when we did this and did this to a panoramic movie that people watched through a VR headset, we get something like this. And so there are a lot of dogs in this image. What's happening is the network is projecting predictions of dog into this panoramic video at every level of granularity. It's not just photoshopping dog pictures onto each frame. They're emerging from the image in a weird way. And what's critical here is that this isn't a computational model of a function or of a behavior. It's a computational model of what an experience is like. I think that shows the power of this approach to try to understand the nature of our conscious experiences. Now, we're taking this a lot further at the moment with my colleagues Keisuke Suzuki and David Schwartzman and Alec Chance, using a bit more complicated neural network models with generative and discriminative components to try to simulate different kinds of visual hallucination here. And I'll just give you a taste for this. So what we do by parameterizing this network in different ways, we take all of these input images and we end up with different kinds of simulated hallucination of the sort that people get when they have Parkinson's disease or dementia or Charles-Bonnet syndrome, when they lose their central vision, as well as different kinds of psychedelic experience. So we're now actually able to model different kinds of visual hallucination. And then we're going back to people who have these different conditions and asking them to pick from our model what is most representative of their own actual lived experience. So we kind of close the loop on this computational phenomenological approach. And the idea is this gives us a handle on understanding the computational basis of altered perception. And by doing that, we understand more about normal perception too. So the take home from this is that hallucination of the sort that we've just seen can be thought of as a kind of uncontrolled perception where the brain's best guesses are not well controlled by sensory signals. But that normal perception in the here and now all the time is also a kind of hallucination, but a controlled hallucination in which the brain's predictions are reined in by sensory signals coming from the world, controlled by these sensory signals, in ways that are not determined by their accuracy, but by their utility for the organism. And the larger claim here is that this applies to everything. It applies to not just faces or dogs, but to all the aspects of our experience of the world and of the self. There are all kinds of different kinds of perceptual best guesses. Now, I want to finish by saying that this applies also to the self, to the experience of being a self. And this gets at another intuition I think we need to undercut. And this intuition is that there's a world which is perceived by the self. The self is somehow inside the brain and body, perceiving the world and then acting upon it. We sense, we think, we act. That's how things seem. But how things are is a bit different, I think. That both experiences of the world and of the self are kinds of perceptual prediction. The self is not the thing that does the perceiving. The self is a perception too. And it's created in the same way. It's created by a process of brain-based best guessing. And there are many ways in which we experience being a self. I'll just focus on one of them, which is the experience of this object in the world that is my body, the experience of embodiment, a core part of what it means to be me. And there's two parts of this too. One of them is this experience of just having a body, this object in the world that is the body. And the brain is continually inferring what parts of the world are its body and what aren't. And we can see disruptions of this in things like the rubber hand illusion and things like phantom limb syndrome and so on. But there's also a very basic experience of being a body, of being an embodied living organism, associated with moods, with emotions, and at its core, what I propose is just this basic sense of being alive, the feeling of being alive. I think is the core to all our experiences of self and of consciousness in general. Now, this experience of being a body of emotion and mood brings up this interesting field of interoception, not introspection, but interoception. And we normally think of sensation and perception as pertaining to the outside world: smell, taste, touch, hearing, vision. But a large territory in the brain, a large amount of neural resource is dedicated to perceiving and controlling sensory signals that come from inside the body. This is interoception, sensation perception of the physiological interior of the body. These interoceptive sensory signals communicate to the brain things like blood pressure and heart rate and gastric tension and blood oxygenation and all these sorts of things. And this is critical because you think about it, the primary point of having a brain is not to do science or philosophy or even language. It's to keep the body alive. It's to stay alive. That's what brains are fundamentally for. Now, interoception, even though the brain is dealing with signals that come from inside the body, it still has no direct access to what their causes in the body are. So an idea I've been proposing for many years is that interoception still has to work by this same basic principle of prediction and prediction error. The brain makes a best guess about causes of signals from inside the body, and updates it with prediction errors, and that's what we perceive when we experience things like emotion and mood and embodied selfhood. And there's a critical aspect to this, which I think I want to emphasize, which is that interoceptive predictions are about controlling things rather than finding things out. Like in vision, for instance, typically the brain wants to figure out what's there. Is it coming towards me or away from me? Is it likely to hurt? Should I eat it? Should I catch it? Should I avoid it? Interoceptive predictions about the interior of the body, they don't care where the kidneys are, where the lungs are, what shape anything is. They care about how well regulation of the internal physiology is going, how good a job the brain is doing of keeping the body alive. And predictions can be used for control. In fact, this is another I don't have time to talk about today, but huge motivation for this view is that this prediction error cycle is an extremely good way of implementing control, of keeping essential physiological quantities like blood pressure and heart rate and so on where they need to be in order to stay alive. But it also explains, and this is what I do want to mention in closing, that why different experiences are the way they are. So visual predictions underpin visual perceptual experiences. The brain cares about what's there. We see objects with spaces in between. Things have a character of spatiality and distances and so on. But interoceptive predictions underpin embodied experience. Interoceptive predictions are all about control and regulation. So we experience emotions, not in terms of things in different places, but in terms of valence, in terms of how well or badly things are going. So this exemplifies this real problem approach. We can start to understand the differences between different kinds of experiences in terms of different kinds of predictions. So let me wrap up. What I've tried to explain today is that what we consciously see depends on the brain's best guesses of the causes of sensory signals. This applies to our experiences of things in the world, but it also applies to experiences of being a self, of, for instance, the body as an object in the world, but also of just the experience of being a body, of being a living organism. And these deep-rooted embodied experiences have more to do with control and regulation than with what's there. Now, in the book, I make the case that this is actually the fundamental role of a brain is to keep the body alive, so we can understand the origin of all perceptual experiences now in terms of their roots in evolution and development and in the day-to-day operation in regulating the body, in life itself. So this brings consciousness much closer to life than to other things like intelligence and so on. And it provides a nice contrast to finish with an old idea of René Descartes. Descartes always gets criticized. I don't want to criticize him too much. He was living in difficult times. But he said, for instance, that talking about other animals, that without minds to direct their movements, animals must be regarded as unthinking, unfeeling machines that move like clockwork. He called them bait machine or beast machines. For Descartes, the status of being alive was irrelevant to the status of being a conscious organism, at least the kind of consciousness that mattered. And I think entirely the opposite, that life and consciousness are intimately connected. We cannot understand consciousness except in light of our nature as living machines, and we perceive the world around us and ourselves within it through and because of our living bodies. I want to finish there.